You are 7 years old when the knock comes. The dogs outside stop barking. Even the wind seems to pause. When the wooden door swings open, the men standing there wear robes that glint with authority and carry scrolls thicker than your arm. By morning, your laughter will be gone from the fields, your name scrubbed from the village registry, your existence replaced by a mark of ink in an Ottoman ledger. If you're drawn to stories that peel back the forgotten layers of history, the parts too unsettling for textbooks, consider subscribing to join this growing community of historical truth seekers. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Every week, people from cities, villages, and islands across the world gather here to remember the past that power wanted us to forget. The system the Ottomans called devshirme, literally the collection, was both a tax and a ritual of erasure. It began as a tool of empire building and became an institution of psychological control. Officials traveled through Christian lands of the Balkans, accompanied by soldiers and scribes. Their mission wasn't conquest, it was harvest. From each village they selected the most promising boys, often between the ages of 8 and 14, though witnesses recorded some taken as young as 5. They measured bodies and faces, checked teeth and posture, and asked questions through interpreters. A boy who spoke too boldly was noted for spirit. One who trembled too much was dismissed as weak. Every selection was logged, sealed, and sent to Constantinople. Villagers called it the blood tax. They watched their sons disappear into carts bound for distant cities, never to return. There are accounts from the 15th century of mothers disfiguring their own children, breaking teeth, burning faces, so that the collectors would pass them by. It rarely worked. The officials kept records so precise that even scars could be explained away as accidents. The empire needed men, one Ottoman bureaucrat wrote coldly, and God has given us fertile soil. The journey from the mountains of Albania or the valleys of Serbia to the Ottoman capital was long and deliberate. Along the road, the boys were separated from anyone who shared their language. Silence became the empire's first teacher. By the time they reached the Anatolian plains, they no longer heard familiar words. In the palace schools where they were kept, Turkish and Arabic replaced every syllable of home. They were given new names, often chosen from the Quran or from the lineage of previous servants. The act of renaming was not a formality, it was a transformation. Those who showed intelligence were trained for administration or courtly service. The strongest were shaped into janissaries, the Sultan's elite soldiers. To Europeans, the janissaries were symbols of fear, disciplined, devout, and deadly. But beneath the iron discipline lay a paradox. The empire's most loyal defenders were the children it had stolen from its enemies. Conversion to Islam was mandatory, but conversion alone wasn't enough. The boys underwent years of conditioning designed to erase attachment and reforge identity. They were forbidden to correspond with family or mention their birthplaces. Any sign of nostalgia was punished. Records describe boys whipped for whispering Christian prayers in their sleep. Some adapted, others broke. One Venetian envoy wrote of meeting a high-ranking janissary officer who confessed, "I do not know my name before the Sultan named me. Sometimes in dreams I see a woman crying, and I do not know why." These were not isolated tragedies. They were the design of a system that understood that obedience required amnesia. The Ottoman state gained from it an unparalleled human engine. Every janissary, every palace guard, every bureaucrat trained through Devshirme carried the discipline of the state in his bones. The empire's expansion into Europe was fueled not only by gunpowder and horses, but by generations of converted children who had learned to love their captor. The policy's efficiency bordered on the surreal. Ledgers show the number of boys taken, trained, promoted, even retired, as though they were military equipment. Each life quantified, categorized, and repurposed. Yet, behind the polished symmetry of Ottoman power, witnesses saw the human cost. Priests recorded villages emptied of sons, fathers driven to madness, mothers walking barefoot for months toward Istanbul in futile hope. Some boys, once risen to power, returned decades later as Ottoman officials themselves. There are haunting stories of villages celebrating their arrival with bread and salt, unaware that the elegant man in silk robes was once one of their own, now unable or unwilling to recognize the faces of those who raised him. Historians still debate how many were taken over the centuries. Hundreds of thousands, perhaps more. But numbers cannot express what was lost. A generation of languages faded, lullabies went unsung, family names dissolved into silence. Empires are often remembered for what they built, their mosques, their armies, their art. But here was a system that built power by unmaking identity itself. As the 17th century dawned, the devshirme began to wane, replaced by mercenary recruitment and modern bureaucracy. Yet the ghosts of that levy remain scattered across 3 continents, hidden in surnames, in genetic traces, in half-remembered family legends. Some descendants still wonder why their ancestors carried Turkish names but prayed in Orthodox churches. The empire's brilliance lay not just in conquest, but in how thoroughly it blurred the borders between victim and servant, faith and obedience, memory and erasure. And somewhere in an archive in Istanbul, a ledger still exists, rows of ink on faded paper, listing names of children who never returned home. The parchment crackles softly when touched, like the echo of footsteps vanishing down a road that history can still hear. At dawn, the courtyards of Topkapi shimmered with a beauty that disguised cruelty. The gardens were soaked in rosewater, and the marble floors reflected the pink of the rising sun. From a distance, it seemed like paradise, a city within a palace. But within its walls, every breath, every glance, every heartbeat was measured against the will of the Sultan. Behind jeweled lattices, servants bowed in silence, eunuchs shuffled through corridors polished to a mirror sheen, and the empire's most guarded secret, the machinery of desire, moved unseen but never unrecorded. To outsiders, the harem was a realm of luxury and perfume, an exotic dream glimpsed through gossip and legend. In truth, it was an institution of precise control, part prison, part court, part breeding ground for loyalty. Its architecture told the story before its people did. High walls without windows, iron gates that locked from the outside, and chambers arranged so that sound could travel one way only, from master to servant, from command to submission. At the heart of this labyrinth were the eunuchs. Their presence defined the limits of every other life inside. The black eunuchs, most of them taken from Sudan or Ethiopia, guarded the innermost sections of the harem, the sultan's private chambers and the apartments of his wives and concubines. Their leader, the Kuzlar Aasu, wielded power rivaling that of ministers. Beneath him served hundreds of others, gatekeepers, messengers, tutors, and spies. They were both protectors and prisoners, the living symbols of the empire's obsession with control over the human body. The making of a eunuch was an act of statecraft as much as violence. Boys were taken along the trade routes from East Africa or the Nile Valley, sold in Cairo's secret markets, and subjected to operations performed by non-Muslim surgeons so the empire could deny religious responsibility. Most did not survive. Those who did were considered purified by suffering, cleansed, as one Ottoman physician wrote, of the tempest that drives men to folly. They were given new names, new duties, and lifelong proximity to power. Their mutilation bought them survival in a world where beauty often meant death. Visitors to Topkapi often wrote of the unsettling quiet of the eunuchs' corridors. The Spanish envoy, Ruy González de Clavijo, described them as ghosts in flesh, men without voice or laughter. They moved soundlessly, carrying commands, watching every door. To the concubines, they were both warden and confessor, the only men permitted to look upon them. One Venetian traveler claimed to have seen a eunuch whispering prayers outside the women's quarters long after midnight, his face streaked with tears. "He prays," the guide told him, "for what was taken from him." The concubines, too, lived within a paradox. Taken from across the empire, Circassian villages, Greek islands, North African coasts, they were purchased for their beauty, trained for obedience, and ranked by favor. Those who pleased the Sultan could become powerful beyond imagination. Those who did not might never leave their rooms again. The odalisques were schooled in languages, poetry, music, and seduction, their days governed by the sound of the call to prayer and the footsteps of eunuchs delivering orders. For a select few, intimacy with the Sultan offered transformation. If a concubine bore a son, she became the Valid Sultan, mother of a potential ruler, a position that could shape the fate of nations. Behind every sultan stood a line of women who had survived the harem's crucible, outwitted rivals, and mastered the art of invisible power. But for every woman who rose, hundreds disappeared, their names erased, their graves unmarked. In the palace registers, beauty had a price. Records from the 17th century list payments to slave dealers: 2,000 kurush for a fair-skinned Circassian girl, 2,500 for a Georgian, 700 for a Nubian. The documents read like inventories of furniture or spices. Yet these were not faceless statistics. They were lives. In a single page of one surviving ledger, 46 names appear, each followed by a note in Ottoman script: healthy, musical, obedient. The empire's administrators had reduced the complexities of desire to a system of accounting. Topkapi's walls contained both intimacy and terror. When a concubine fell out of favor, she could be dismissed to the old palace, an exile worse than death, or drowned quietly in the Bosphorus, tied inside a silk sack so that no blood would spill. These were not rumors. Ambassadors recorded the practice with the detached tone of bureaucrats describing trade tariffs. Within the palace, silence was protection. Gossip could end a life as swiftly as a sultan's command. Yet the system endured because it worked. The eunuchs ensured discretion. The concubines provided heirs and alliances. The palace itself became a living engine of dynasty. Power flowed through flesh and control through fear. Even religion bent to accommodate it. Jurists debated whether eunuchs had souls, whether a concubine's consent mattered, whether pleasure could coexist with sanctity. The answers were always pragmatic. The empire's survival required that bodies remain obedient instruments of rule. By the late 18th century, Western visitors began to romanticize the harem, painting it as a sensual paradise. Artists filled canvases with reclining women and half-draped silks, but the truth was far more brutal. The scent of rosewater they imagined was often used to mask the iron tang of blood after castration, the perfume of obedience. The music of the courtyards, played on flutes and drums, was meant to drown out the cries from the training chambers below. Even as reform swept the empire in its final centuries, the structure remained intact. Eunuchs still guarded gates, women still competed for the sultan's glance, and the palace still stood as the empire's most potent metaphor, beautiful from afar, unbearable up close. In the twilight of Ottoman power, European diplomats visiting Topkapi described it as a paradise built on absence. When the empire finally fell, the gates of the harem were opened to daylight for the first time in 600 years. What they found inside were rooms filled with silence, portraits of forgotten faces, and the lingering fragrance of rosewater mixed with rust. The palace stood empty, but the echo of footsteps, soft, measured, and eternal, still seemed to move through the halls. And somewhere, in the hush that followed, the ghosts of those unmade lives still whispered the one question that no empire could answer: what remains of a civilization when it has traded its humanity for perfection? In the heart of Constantinople, the sound of trade was constant. Iron striking iron, merchants shouting numbers, the clatter of coin against copper trays. Yet among the scents of cinnamon, amber, and leather hung another odor, faint but unmistakable: sweat, fear, and rose oil. This was the smell of the Asir Pazara, the slave market, where bodies were measured like cloth and weighed like livestock. The sunlight poured through latticed canopies, illuminating faces from 3 continents, each marked with a price, each carrying a story that would never be written. To the empire's chroniclers, these markets were simply another form of commerce. The same pens that recorded grain shipments and tax revenues also listed human beings. 2 Greek girls aged 12 and 14. 1 Nubian boy, 8. 1 Circassian woman, virginal, skilled in embroidery. Traders worked in the open, their voices carrying down the marble streets. The market ran on a rhythm older than memory. Every day, new arrivals, new bargains, new disappearances. The Ottomans inherited slavery from empires before them, but they perfected its bureaucracy. Caravans from the African interior brought captives across the Sahara to Egypt, where dealers sorted them by age, color, and strength. From there, the ships took them north, to the ports of Izmir, Alexandria, and finally the capital itself. The Balkan Wars provided another supply line. Christian captives marched through mountain passes, guarded by soldiers who kept ledgers as carefully as priests kept scripture. The empire's own legal code sanctioned the trade, offering merchants protection so long as their slaves were infidel by birth. Faith became a license for bondage. Yet within this system of cruelty lay another paradox. Enslaved women could rise higher than free ones if they entered the palace. A beautiful Georgian concubine could, through wit and timing, become the mother of a sultan. In contrast, a free woman of common birth might live her entire life unseen. The market gave the illusion of social mobility while binding everyone tighter to its machinery. Every transaction, every whispered bid, fed an empire that equated possession with divinity. European visitors were horrified and fascinated in equal measure. They wrote letters filled with moral outrage and envy. Some came to buy slaves themselves, cloaking their transactions as gifts for diplomacy. The Venetian ambassador, Pietro Bragadin, recorded his visit to the market in 1554. The girls stood silent, their eyes lowered, as the broker opened their mouths to show their teeth. He turned them by the shoulders as though displaying horses. The Sultan's buyers watched closely, speaking little. One nodded, and a life was decided. These were not isolated cruelties. The trade in flesh was the empire's quiet foundation. Taxes on slave sales filled imperial treasuries. Eunuch households depended on the traffic of new servants. Even religious endowments, charities, and mosques profited from the labor of enslaved workers. Economists in the Ottoman Chancery wrote of the necessity of the trade for maintaining balance between luxury and devotion. The empire's moral conscience, it seemed, could coexist comfortably with its appetite. By the 18th century, the markets of Constantinople were among the busiest in the world. It was said you could find a person from every land within its walls: Greeks, Circassians, Persians, Ethiopians, Russians, Arabs. The brokers spoke a dozen languages, their cries blending into a single mercantile chant. One traveler compared the sound to a liturgy without God. The system even had its own etiquette. Slaves were bathed and perfumed before being shown. Potential buyers touched wrist to check for fever, inspected feet for calluses, and inquired whether the goods had been used. Behind every question lay an unspoken violence. Still, for all its cruelty, the empire cloaked the trade in ceremony. Purchases were followed by prayers, legal contracts signed under the watch of clerics, and blessings offered for the welfare of both owner and owned. The Ottoman imagination reconciled these contradictions through myth. It spoke of the harem as paradise, of the eunuch as holy guardian, of the enslaved woman as instrument of divine will. Beauty became theology, and theology became justification. But markets leave residues deeper than coins or contracts. Centuries later, genetic studies across Anatolia and the Balkans reveal faint traces of African and Caucasian lineages, silent witnesses to centuries of intimacy without consent. Folk songs in Albania still speak of the child sold to the crescent, And in Egypt, descendants of palace eunuchs maintain family names derived from their former masters. The trade ended on paper in the 19th century, yet its ghosts persist in language, in complexion, in the uneasy silences of history. When the empire finally collapsed, the new republic sought to bury these memories. The slave markets were dismantled, their stones reused for warehouses and shops. Archives were sealed or burned, and official history spoke only of glory, never of commerce in flesh. Yet travelers in the 1920s still reported seeing old women in Istanbul who bore the tattoos of slave ownership, faint inked marks on the inner arm, like the shadow of a brand. The past, it seemed, refused to fade. What does a civilization do with such knowledge? Can it celebrate its architecture and art without hearing the cries that once echoed beneath its domes? The Ottoman world built mosques that touch the sky, but beneath those spires lay foundations of human pain. The stones remember even when nations forget. Today, tourists wander the old markets, cameras clicking where lives were once sold. Coffee scents replace the musk of fear, yet on humid days the Bosphorus wind carries something older, the trace of rosewater and rust. Beneath the city's hum, if one listens closely, a buried chorus stirs, the whispers of those history tried to silence.